Okay, hello all, and welcome to the second podcast episode of the Speed Mooting podcast for 2023. We have another fantastic and interesting guest for you tonight. Our guest is Jack Meek, who is a barrister and has previously been a judge at various speed mooting competitions. Hello, Jack.
Hi, John. Thanks very much for having me.
No, my pleasure. Great to have you here. So would you like to start, Jack, with just a brief introduction as to who you are and what you do?
Yes, thanks very much, John. As you say, I'm Jack Meek. I'm a barrister, and what, of course, you haven't said because you're leaving it for me is that I practice as a barrister at the government legal department. But of course, the path to pupillage wasn't necessarily a smooth one, and that may be something that resonates with a lot of people listening this evening. So it seems too simple for me simply to say, hi, I'm Jack Meek. I'm a barrister at the government legal department because it did take a while to get to this point. So I've done a number of things. Came from a background where I studied law at university, which included also a year's study abroad in the United States before coming back, completing my law degree, doing a human rights laws master degree, and then coming across to England from Northern Ireland, where I had previously been studying to study the bar. I'm also New York bar qualified and have done a number of various different things, which I'm sure we can get into if it's of interest before coming into practice.
Wow, quite a lot to dissect there. So you said that you went off to the States to study for a year. Whereabouts was that?
That was in Idaho, of all places, sort of very rural state in the Northwest, quite a small population, but it was part of a scholarship program run by the British Council. So I was out there primarily to focus on business studies, but I did have the opportunity to take some elective modules in constitutional law, in public policy. And as we'll get to, you'll see all of these threads coming together in the fact that, of course, I work within public law for government, advising on the legal implications of public policy, among other things.
Interesting. And of course, you said you've taken the New York bar as well. How did you find that exam?
That's right. I mean, without being melodramatic, I do think it was one of the most difficult things that I've done. There were a number of motivations for it, and I appreciate this is obviously a podcast about the English bar, and that is the thing in which I'm focused. But I had come to bar school in Manchester in 2012, 2013, and that began the long, arduous process of looking for pupillage. But having had the previous American connection, I was always sort of inclined towards exploring my options there a little bit with the view to enhancing my prospects in the bar in England, specifically in London. So I returned to Ireland, and through a law firm there, I did my preparation for the New York bar and flew out, took the exam, having undergone a 5 month course in preparation for that. And very different discipline to the bar here in a way, in the sense that once you complete the exam and you have successfully passed it and then done an ethics exam separately, you sort of fill out the paperwork, you get sworn in, and theoretically you can start working. I think that also takes into account the fact that you go to law school as a postgrad rather than an undergrad, so you are naturally starting your career that little bit later than perhaps you might be in this country, where theoretically you can do your degree, do your bar course, and if you've secured pupillage, get straight into practicing law. But it was one of a number of things that I decided to do as I was looking for pupillage, knowing that there was a lot of competition. It would give me another string to my bow. I am very international in a way in my outlook, perhaps informed by the fact that I come from somewhere so small, Northern Ireland, and I'd had that opportunity to travel abroad and work abroad later on as well, because I won a scholarship from my INF court to go and work in Strasbourg at the European Court of Human Rights. And the reason I bring that into the conversation is simply to highlight the fact that different opportunities present themselves as you're looking for pupillage, or perhaps once you get into practice, and that it's always worth availing yourself of those opportunities because you don't know how beneficial it might be later on down the line. So I appreciate I've strayed from the question slightly, but I always fear that whenever I bring up the New York bar connection, people like to ask about that because it's something a bit different. But it is obviously with a view to enhancing my hopefully my attractiveness as then a prospective candidate and now as a lawyer in practice.
Well, that's it. Absolutely. As you say, that the competition is so fierce out there, whether you're trying to become a solicitor, barrister, legal executive, whatever it might be, there's lots of competition. So you need to find any way whatsoever to help yourself stand out. So I think having that additional qualification will have really helped. You talked about going off to work in Strasbourg as well. How long were you out there for?
Yeah, so I was out there for 3 months at the beginning of 2015. So that followed a period where I had been a paralegal at Herbert Smith Freehills. That was straight after bar school. And through my inn of court, I had applied for this scholarship, knowing that I had the academic background in human rights law. I had also had the opportunity with my inn to go out on a sort of 3-day visit to understand a little bit more about the work of the European Court of Human Rights and its place within the Council of Europe, which of course is a separate body to the European Union. So whenever the opportunity came up to actually go out there and work, I jumped at the chance, was successful in securing that scholarship, and had a great time there for 3 months at the beginning of 2015. And again, this sort of feeds in perhaps to what I'm doing now, and this is because I was getting involved with these sort of international human rights issues where the world of law and public policy come together, and even some of the specific areas of law, like immigration, was priming me for some of the experience I would go on to have in my training with government, because the first seat that I undertook with pupillage at government was indeed with immigration in a litigation context. So all very useful experience, and was also useful for me coming back from Strasbourg and securing a job with Thomson Reuters Practical Law, where I worked as an assistant editor, so reporting on different cases, current awareness, drafting guidance notes for use by barristers, solicitors, other legal professionals in practice. Firstly, with dispute resolution and arbitration as the focus, and then latterly in the Brexit context, so in the aftermath of the 2016 referendum, and then the negotiations that were going on to determine the United Kingdom's withdrawal from the European Union and our future trading relationship. So actually getting in on the ground floor, to use a cliched phrase, to sort of follow that process along, I think was also useful whenever I came to interview for government, because I've been following, one of these big, significant public policy, constitutional, international law issues along the way for a couple of years.
Wow, really interesting. It sounds like you've gained a lot of experience before you even qualified as a barrister. So that sounds like an interesting route. So even though it's taken you some time to get to that stage, you've built up so much experience along the way, haven't you?
I think that's right. And the reason I raise it is not to sort of be immodest or anything like that, but it's more, I hope, to reassure people that you can do some really interesting things in the legal sector more generally. And it's not about losing sight of your end goal. I always think that you have your end goal and you think, okay, the most direct route, you take the motorway and that's how you get there. But actually, there are setbacks that come up along the way, and it's looking at how you can turn those to your advantage. So take the B road, and see, what, is interesting whenever you stop at the services along the way, because actually you could find that those things are not only useful and will enhance your abilities and your skills and help you to develop your career before you even get into practice, but they are useful and enjoyable things in and of themselves.
Yeah, I completely agree. And the way to look at it is from the point of sort of finishing law school to the point that you qualify, you obviously need to do something during that time. Whatever jobs, whatever roles you take on, you can always use those to develop your skills. So I talk about this quite often, but I paralegaled in personal injury for a couple of years before going on to qualify. And I think that's a fantastic opportunity because, for example, I talk about PI. The benefit there is you're dealing with real people, and anybody can be involved in an accident, slip, car accident, whatever it might be. So you're dealing with a broad cross section of the public. You're learning how to deal with people. It's quite law heavy. So I spent a lot of time drafting particulars of claim, drafting applications. I even spent time in court as a paralegal doing advocacy. So I was able to build all the skills that you need as a lawyer during that time. And it sounds like you've done the same. You've used those opportunities to build your skills and get yourself ready for practice.
Exactly. And I think what you said there about sort of the people skills element of it, just learning to work with different people in these different contexts, for me, that was, well, there was an element of that, even just the sort of minor culture clash moving from one part of the United Kingdom to another, Northern Ireland to England, but then having had the opportunity, and I appreciate that I'm fortunate in having been able to avail of these opportunities to go abroad and to work with people from lots of different places and to understand a little bit more about their working practices and how actually their way of doing things can have a benefit to my approach going forward. And I think that for people who are applying for pupillage, one of the key things to try and bring out in your applications and in your interviews is always what you've learned from each of the different experiences you've had. And what I tell mentees or sort of people through different schemes with which I volunteer is that you're trying to sort of build a narrative which shows that sort of everything you've done has logically led you to a certain point. And of course, as you say, it's important in and of itself because you need to demonstrate that you are continuing to develop, because of course, once you get pupillage and once you get into practice, development doesn't stop. You have to keep on top of things. So if you've got into that habit to begin with, I think that's always very useful.
Yeah, it really does stand you in good stead. This is one of those professions where you never stop learning. Even when you speak to really senior members of the profession, they'll always tell you they still make mistakes. They're still learning things. So it's one of those where you've got to be very proactive at any stage of your career. So
Certainly.
yeah, so that was an interesting roadmap there. Was there anything else that you've left out in terms of your route from sort of law school through to pupillage? Any other things that you did?
I think just if I could reflect on the personal motivation just a little bit, and in a way I find this that I'm still slightly uncomfortable doing this because I think the instinct is to sort of keep certain things to yourself, but the longer I've gone on and the more I've advised other people, I can see the value in reflecting within yourself and understanding actually what is it that led you to make the decision where you've wanted to come to this profession. And I think for people who perhaps don't come from backgrounds where they are surrounded by people within the legal profession, or sort of what others might consider the more sort of traditional professions which historically would have required tertiary level education, is they think that you must do things a certain way, you must be from a certain background, you must speak in a certain way. And I've come to realize that that isn't the case, and you shouldn't be afraid of really leaning on your own experience, because it will have informed the way you look at things, the way you think about things, the way you go about doing things. And at the end of the day, you need to be your own salesperson as a lawyer. You're going into practice to advocate on behalf of others. So I always tell mentees, think of yourself as your own client, and only you know your own background, to the level where you can really sort of properly bring out what you've learned. And for me, that was informed very much by where I come from, sort of in Northern Ireland, born at the end of the 80s and sort of approaching the age of 10 whenever the Good Friday Agreement was finally signed. So, part of that last generation which remembers some of the troubles, and then being part of that first generation really to be growing up with the peace process.
Yeah.
But then coming with that was the awareness that all around me growing up was the issue of politics, and by inference, the legal link to that. What is it? Why are things a certain way? Why do people take certain positions on things, and then sort of actually realizing that the law has its part to play. And then as you get older and sort of become more knowledgeable about the context into which you were sort of born and brought up, you realize too how different people have different perspectives, and each of them has validity. And your job then as a lawyer is to put your own personal preferences or personal views aside to be an objective officer of the court. Obviously, it's the term that we use whenever it comes to advocacy. But for me, whenever I think back, it's about realizing that, okay, I would have been brought up surrounded mostly by people who would have thought in one way about things, but coming to realize that there was an equally valid story to tell from another point of view, and realizing that everybody deserves to be treated with equal respect and have their cases tried. I don't mean cases in the literal sense, you know what I mean?
Yeah, of
Sort of
course,
get it tripping over the metaphor a little bit, but to sort of to tie the bow around the point is really just that wherever you're from, don't be afraid of using that experience, and don't feel intimidated that you must act or behave in a certain way. Yes, of course, be professional, sort of abide by sort of what you would expect in terms of etiquette and courtesy, but there is no one template of what a barrister is or should be.
No, completely not. And that's something something we see firsthand on this podcast. Every single person I bring on the podcast is completely different, and so many people across the profession, both solicitors and barristers, have all got their own backgrounds, and I think that's what makes people unique. And I think that can actually help in your practice. You can't, obviously you've got your sort of background, what you've seen growing up, and of course you've seen politics firsthand from a very young age. So these help sort of in your formative years, but you still need to ensure that you come into the profession with an objective viewpoint on whatever it is that you're doing. So I think that's a really interesting point. That, and key thing that you're saying is don't be afraid to be yourself.
Exactly, and it's a point I hope people do take away from what I'm saying, and it's why I've been involved with the Bar Council over the past couple of years as a social mobility advocate, for the challenges that I faced and the length of time it took before I got into pupillage. I maybe wouldn't care about this issue so much, but I've come to realize just how important it is, and it just hopefully takes one person listening to our conversation or to other conversations that are happening and thinking, okay, that's great. I can point to somebody who's saying it doesn't matter where I'm from if I work hard and I'm talented enough, and then I can pass that message on to somebody else.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people probably do come in, and you tend to perhaps roll your eyes when people say, I want to help others, or I want to sort of go and achieve this sort of great altruistic thing. But there is merit in that, and you can get that message across, hopefully with authenticity and with passion.
Yeah, absolutely. It's all about opening the door really for the next generation, isn't it?
Exactly.
Yeah. And I think the other thing, stemming back from what you were saying earlier, you were talking about, I don't know about yourself, but there are certain people that come into the profession with no legal connections whatsoever. I was certainly one of them. I had no lawyers in the family, didn't know any lawyers, etc. And so one of the things that I did was I would try and build my own connection, try and find people in the law. So what I would do is I would go to court, and if I saw barristers or solicitors walking around, I'd have a chat to them, try and strike up a conversation. It's a good way of networking, and it also to try and get experience, right to chambers, right to small firms, whatever it might be. So, if you're somebody without those connections, do what you can to try and really build up your network. So always try and think outside of the box.
Exactly, and don't be afraid, as you say, of doing what you did, John, and approaching people. I know that I've done it, and I'm sort of grateful in a way that because I'm now in the position where I'm in practice, that students have contacted me, whether on LinkedIn or through sort of mutual connections, that they've spoken to somebody else who suggested getting in touch. And I try not to forget the challenges that I face, and I always try to give some time, even if it's a response, to say, look, I will get back to you, but just I'll do it as soon as I possibly can.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know the feeling. I'm the same. I get lots of messages on LinkedIn, and I try and respond as quickly as I can. And it's good to see people, that have got the gumption to go out and
Absolutely.
people in the profession, because ultimately, you send a message to somebody, the worst thing that you're going to have, or even if you approach a member of the profession, the worst that can happen is somebody says no. But alternatively,
Exactly.
the best case scenario is, you've made a connection, you might get some experience, you get some tips, advice, whatever it is. So I'm always happy to give back and answer those questions. Although it sounds like we might be a bit slow at times, but we always try and answer.
Exactly, and I think it's important to not to lose sight of the fact that some of the questions, they might seem obvious to us now, but I always try to remind myself that you may need to be patient with people, because for them, as you say, they really have no connection to the profession before, and they really are coming in at the very beginning of their legal careers, and they just need the very basic questions asked. And one of the first lessons I learned in the first job I had as a greengrocer, sort of back in a small market town in Northern Ireland, was if you don't ask, you don't get. So I would just reiterate that.
Yeah, very true. Words to live by. Yeah, great advice there. So yeah. Okay, so we'll move on to the next point, or the next part of the podcast. So would you like to talk to us a little bit about your role and what that involves?
Certainly, you'll appreciate that, because I do work for government. I will sort of perhaps make this a bit more concise. I appreciate that. On the other point, I do tend to talk for Ireland, as they say. But yes, I completed pupillage with the government legal department, and some of you may be familiar with this process, but training within government, the legal training scheme, is actually a 2-year program. They train solicitors and barristers together, but pupillage makes up the first year. So you do qualify at the bar after 1 year, but you then complete a second year's training. That also allows for the fact that within your pupillage year, you are mainly focused on contentious work. So you tend to start doing litigation in the immigration field before then being seconded to chambers. And then in your second training year, so post qualification at the bar, you would go into one of 2 advisory roles, where you are doing advisory work, which I think is quite unique to government. So you're working within different government departments, advising on the legal implications of policy. You may have some work that involves advising on legislation itself, and that can obviously be incredibly varied. You can find that you're working on very complex things from a very early stage in your career, as well as things that are in the news. So just to give a very brief flavor of what I was doing throughout those 2 years, before just touching briefly on what I'm doing now, I did immigration for my first 6 before being seconded to a commercial chancery set of chambers, Selborne chambers in London. I then came back in to work on the Northern Ireland Protocol legal team within government. And then I was working with the government's commercial law group. So that was quite interesting, just to observe the mechanics of government and working in the sphere mostly of public procurement. Since September 2022, so September last year, I've been working now as a qualified government lawyer, as well as a qualified barrister within the Department for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. So working in the environmental sphere, and I'm very much enjoying that. And I think really what is worth noting for people, that if you are interested in a career in public law, I think there is very unique work to be found in government, and also you do have the opportunity to specialize, yes, if you want to, once you've gone through the initial stages of your career development at GLD, but you can also move around and seek promotion and sort of develop expertise in different areas as you progress throughout your career. And I think that can be attractive to people, as well as perhaps a better work-life balance than you might find in some areas of self-employment at the bar. That's not to disparage self-employed barristers at all, of course, but it's just thinking about what's important to you listening. What I would say more generally is, if you are interested in an area of practice, that's what I would focus on, because you're more likely to enjoy things. I knew that I wanted to work within GLD because I was interested in law and politics, and so I, throughout those sort of 6 years applying for pupillage before I finally secured it, I was applying to GLD every single year because that's where I wanted to go.
Yeah. Oh, that's brilliant. It's great to hear that you've landed your dream job anyway. That sounds so varied. I've never come across anyone that's told me that they've experienced so many different areas of law in such a short space of time.
Exactly.
It sounds like you've covered quite a lot, and it's obviously sort of important work as well. So it sounds really interesting. And I think the other point that you touched on there is do what you enjoy. I always remember years ago, I went to an event when I was a student, and I was I imagine most students do go through a similar phase where one week they're interested in this area of law, the next week it's something else. And I'd mentioned something to this practitioner, and he said the best advice I can give you is when it comes to practice, do what you enjoy. Don't think about money or anything like that, because if you go after an area of law just because you think that lawyers in that area are wealthy, you're not going to enjoy it. You're not going to have a good career. Go for what you enjoy, and you'll enjoy your career, and you'll probably prosper better anyway. So
yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. I think as well that perhaps some people who do think about it more cynically, yeah, perhaps it does work out, but I suspect that ultimately things will catch up with you if you're not enjoying something. I'm sure you hear stories. I hear stories of friends in other areas of practice who simply feel burnt out.
Yeah.
And fortunately, I am doing work that I find interesting, and some of the areas, like you'll appreciate that the Northern Ireland work had a personal as well as a professional interest for me, but other things that I hadn't contemplated before starting at government in September 2020, I've been introduced to them, and then you find actually there's really interesting work to be done there as well.
Yeah, definitely. So
if I could just, sorry, just it reminds me as well for people that are in the position that you highlight where they're not really sure and they're sort of going, they're trying to make their mind up as to what area. I think it's useful to get as much experience as you can. If you're not sure that you want to go into crime or family or commercial law or whatever else it is, go and do different mini pupillages, do different vacation schemes in different areas, because you can learn as much about what you don't want to do as you can about what you do want to do.
Absolutely, very true. I think I was mentioning this to somebody. I think I was on a podcast or a Q&A or something, and I enjoyed studying intellectual property at university. So I was our year were one of the first, or we were the first year to study intellectual property. Got a first class in the module. Really enjoyed it. So I thought, oh, maybe this is for me. So I wrote to a firm that specialised in that area. Said, can I have a couple of days? I want to see what this is like. Went in, found out that for me, IP was just something I didn't like at the coalface. I enjoyed the theory of it, but I think the practice just wasn't for me. There were other areas I was more suited to. So I think that's a perfect example of try and get yourself out there, see as many different areas as you can, and you'll know what you like. And it also will help you when it comes to interviews as well, because if you're asked the question, why are you interested in this area of law, or why not this area, you can say, well, I've seen this, I went to court, didn't like these types of cases, I prefer this because. So you've actually got some substance to back up your answers as well.
No, agreed.
Yeah. So you've obviously been practicing for a little while now. Just for our listeners, what would you say are some of the good skills to have as a barrister?
The first one I would say is communication, because I think that encompasses a number of things. Obviously, advocacy, but advocacy encompasses more than simply going into court and pleading a case. In the interests of transparency, I don't do an awful lot of courtroom advocacy day to day in my role, but if I'm having to engage with people at a political level or sort of have some very frank conversations with clients, it still requires those skills that you might employ in front of a judge, because you're having to put a case and persuade people, and defer to sort of other points that may arise. But also, obviously, communication skills help whenever it comes to your written advocacy, because you need to be able to convey information comprehensively, yes, but also concisely in a way that is easily understood by people who are perhaps not as immersed in legalese as we might be. And I do always find it funny to observe sort of people coming in say on work experience and things like that that I will have observed in the past. And sort of, I think this again feeds into the fact that having had the benefit of working for quite a while before coming into practice, it just always amused me that I think for people who are quite young and inexperienced, they think that you must sort of speak in a certain way or send an email in a certain way, and you think it's like, why are you using 4 words where one will do? Sort of part of good advocacy is about knowing what not to say as well as it is knowing what to say. And then with communication, to finalize that sort of first point, is the people skills element. And I know you touched on this, John, in a previous question, previous chat we were having earlier on this evening. But understanding that you will be dealing with different people from different backgrounds with different priorities, and knowing that you will need to be able to tailor your approach to your audience depending on their level of understanding or engagement, or where they're starting from. So I think communication skills are the first thing that will strike a lot of barristers probably in practice, and should be one of the first things that you should be thinking about if you are a prospective barrister coming along. The second skill that I would urge people to think about is the need for good intellectual skills. And I don't necessarily mean by that you need to have been the best academically, because intellect comes in many different forms, but it's, to my mind, having good intellectual skills beyond the academic. It's the basis, for example, for good research. It's knowing what questions to ask. It's knowing, how to analyze the information that's presented to you, knowing how to spot gaps, knowing where to go for your answers, and knowing how to apply your research so that it informs your advice. I think with your intellect comes hopefully the ability to think practically if you're coming into this job, because oftentimes it's not about telling the client or whoever else all the stuff about an area of law. It's about being able to distill the key information, identifying what's relevant, setting aside what's irrelevant, and providing practical solutions. And sometimes that might involve identifying something the client wants, even if they don't actually know they want it. I remember that was a very useful piece of advice that I received during pupillage whenever I was seconded. My chamber supervisor, sort of whenever he was reviewing an opinion or pleadings that I had drafted, encouraging me to think sort of beyond the confines of the initial question. Yes, always having, bearing in mind that question is there, but thinking about, what are the solutions? What are the different things that you can come up with to achieve the best result for your client? Or a phrase that we would come across in government quite a lot, the idea of thinking innovatively. So that's why I would stress the need for a good intellectual basis for this job. And then the third thing that I have been thinking about is that to be a good lawyer, I think you should be skilled in empathy, being able to put yourself in others' shoes. And perhaps, John, you work in the criminal sphere. You'll understand this perhaps better than others who are working in different areas of law. But I do think it's a point that applies across the board, is that you need to understand others' perspectives. And you'll see, like we were talking about my experience growing up where I'm from, understanding that people do have a different view on things, and it's respecting people even if you don't agree with them. And learning those lessons, and sometimes having the humility to accept that, and having it inform your approach. And ultimately there is the cynical part that perhaps comes with that you could brush it off as, well, how important in the grand scheme of things is a good bedside manner if you're getting results. But if you're thinking about it commercially, you want to attract repeat business. And if your clients like you, that will make it easier for you to do so.
Definitely. Yeah, that's the way to think about it. Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head there. Three really good points. I mean, coming back to communication, as you say, firstly, you'd think, well, it's just advocacy, but it's more than that. As a good lawyer, you need to be persuasive at all times. And sometimes cases can be won before you even get to the courtroom just by having those good communication skills and by being persuasive. You can speak to your opponent before you go into court, let them know why you're running certain points, and sometimes your opponent will pick up, okay, right, yeah, maybe we've not got a case, concede certain points, you can agree certain things, it makes the trials run more smoothly, or may result in a trial cracking, for example. So the good communication can start before you even get into the courtroom itself.
I was told a story that somebody knew a particular judge who the first thing they did whenever they saw somebody's pleadings in front of them was to turn to the back page and see who wrote it. And if they were known to the judge, might have an idea, oh, this person, I sort of quite like the way they present things generally. And if you can, become known for having that skill, I think that's useful. And with that advice was something that I think was useful, was passed on to me, which was, regardless of whether, say, you're pleading, a claimant's side, or a defendant's side, a respondent's side, a claim or a defense, you should be able to look at the pleading as you sort of in isolation and have a full understanding of the issues that are going on, rather than it simply being a response to something, for example. And I think sometimes, especially in your early days of practice, you think, right, there's a textbook way of doing this, that you lose sight of the bigger picture. But obviously practice makes as close to perfect as it's possible to get in this profession, and you'll find that your communication skills will only get better over time.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what you were talking about there with, a judge looking to the back and looking at who's drafted the pleadings, a lot of that comes down to reputation as well. And I think that crosses over with your bedside manner, because there's a certain way that you need to present yourself in terms of to the judge, to your opponents, etc. And I think the key thing is following the ethical guidelines. Make sure that you're an ethical lawyer and play with a straight bat as well, because if you find that you're bending the rules, that word spreads quickly, and you lose your reputation. Whereas if you've got a reputation as a good, honest practitioner that's ethical, people can trust you, and it makes it much easier for people to deal with you on your cases as well. So
yeah,
I think
honestly should always be the starting point. And I say this whether it's anything you're doing in practice or even in your application, just be transparent. Because the worst that can happen is you'll be asked a question and you'll give further explanation, but it's better than being caught out, because often that is worse than simply having sort of been upfront in the first place.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, I think we've covered a lot there. So of course you're on the speed mooting podcast, Jack. Did you do much mooting at all at university?
I did do some mooting at university, and then I've had the privilege of judging some of the speed mooting rounds, as well as coaching at Lincoln's Inn. So I may be a bit rusty on the mooting side of things, but it's certainly been one of the extracurricular things I've been involved with in the past.
Yeah. So how important would you say mooting is for aspiring barristers and solicitors?
I think it is important, and not just because we're obviously on the speed mooting podcast, but we've talked a lot about the different experiences that I've had, that you've had, in terms of our practical work experience. And then I think sometimes you lose sight of actually the initial things you did to sort of get an insight into this job. And I think for those people we were talking about, especially who don't have the background in law, don't have the initial connections, just doing an activity which helps you to develop those skills and get thinking like a lawyer is always going to be useful. And I think it's one of the things that you will look for on an application form, because you take it for granted that somebody coming into this profession will hopefully have gone and done some public speaking experience. Mooting obviously being the most reflective of what things are like in practice. For me, I started off very much doing a lot of debating at school and at university and at college in the States, but from the practical point of view, also getting involved in mooting as well.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, I completely agree with that. I mean, because one of the questions that's always going to come up is why will you make a good barrister? So if you've actually taken part in moots, and hopefully won competitions, you can say, well, here's first-hand evidence of how good my advocacy is. That's why I would make a good barrister. So it certainly helps you when it comes to your applications as well. So of course, you've mentioned that you've judged a few competitions for us as well. And what are some of the common mistakes that you see from mooters that come before you?
The first thing I think that I always pick up on is people's structure. And I know that for the purposes of this discussion, we have a structure and we're
Mm.
trying to stick to main points. But for the purposes of an informal chat, the conversation will often go places where the structure didn't allow for that to begin with. But whenever it comes to a formal exercise, you can do so much and achieve so much with just having a good structure, road mapping from the very outset where you're going to go and making it easy for people to follow along. Because if you think about it and put yourself in the shoes of a barrister in court who's trying to engage a judge or a member of a jury, people that are trying to take notes and keep up with things, if you're road mapping and talking them through things in a logical way, that's doing a lot of the work for you. And it's one of those things that people miss, so much. And I don't think there's any sort of main trick to this. You'll often find, I'm sure you've given this advice. I know everybody that I've worked with who coaches public speaking in some way always sort of champions the rule of three. Have
Yeah.
three good points. And I remember a debate coach in the States, sort of going into the business psychology of that and saying, from your young age, we're taught to think in terms of you have three, one, two, threes, ABCs,
ABC, yeah.
Goldilocks, and the three bears, three little pigs. Without putting too fine a point on it, obviously I work in the political space, and you'll find that politicians, whenever they're making their points or making presentations, there's often three things to go because they're easily digestible. It's not. I don't think it's not a coincidence that a lot of public policy can be distilled into three words or is distilled into three words whenever it comes to political campaigns, because people remember
Mm.
that, and so just some things to think about, that there is method in the madness of us insisting time and again have 3 points.
Yeah.
So that's the first thing I think that I would always pick up upon. I think the second is that people often lose sight of the fact that it's sometimes just a conversation. With mooting is not necessarily always, or courtroom advocacy or whatever else. It's not always a case of I'm going in with a complete script and I'm going to deliver sort of this presentation and that's it. There is a dialogue to be had. So watch the judge react to their body language, react to their questions, and don't feel like you need to stick rigidly to something if the process naturally evolves away from that. And then I think the third related point, and you'll see
Mhm.
there 3 points, is that if you are asked a question or if you are interrupted, don't feel like you need to launch straight into an answer to fill empty space. There is no harm in taking the time to reflect upon what you want to say and then articulating it, because we will know if you are simply trying to fill space. And
Yeah.
believe me, it seems the space that you think you're leaving before answering a question seems so much more to you than it does to us.
Yeah, exactly. Completely agree. That's I think judicial intervention is probably the most important part of a moot, because particularly if you're in a high level moot where you've got two sort of mooters of equivalent levels, sometimes judicial intervention could be the thing that sort of breaks the tie and can determine the winner. So that's one of those skills that you really need. And I think the key thing is, like you said, take the time, just pause. It might feel like an eternity, but it's literally a couple of seconds. So take the time, have a think, and then at least that way you're going to give an answer that's sort of well thought through, rather than saying something and then halfway through the sentence realizing, my better point would have been, and then backtracking. So just take the time and have a think. Nothing wrong with that whatsoever.
Exactly. You'll often find if you go to like your different events that you're in of court, whenever you have barristers who are particularly long in the tooth, or sort of judges who have been around for a long time, that whenever they're giving their lectures or whatever, they are very slow and deliberate in the way they speak. And I am very aware of the fact that naturally I tend to speak quite quickly, because where I come from,
Hmm.
people speak very quickly, and it doesn't matter how long I've been away from home, that instinct is always there. And I'm trying to keep it in mind as we're having this conversation for this recording. But I know that the gaps that I think exist, they're hopefully not going to come across that way whenever you have the finished broadcast or whatever else. And the same thing applies whenever it comes to making your presentations in a mood or any other form of public speaking.
All right, so we're coming up towards the end of the podcast now. So just before we finish off, Jack, have you got any sort of general advice for aspiring lawyers? Any last words to leave them with?
Yeah, I tend to come back to the same 3 points, and apologies for those of you who may have read things I've written in the past or heard me speaking, but I think these are worth repeating. Some of them have been touched on. The first is don't give up. And I don't think I need to say anything more. Hopefully that has come across in this conversation. Likewise, the second point, do take every opportunity that comes your way, because you don't know how valuable it might be. And even if it's not ultimately valuable from a cynical point of view, you might end up enjoying yourself along the way. And the third thing, which we haven't really touched upon, but which I do think is important, even though people may brush it aside, is to have a hinterland. I think sort of have other interests that keep you grounded. It's very easy to think that this job, as wonderful as it is the be all and end all, especially if you are in the position perhaps like me, or some others, where you've had to really work for a much longer time than you thought to achieve your ultimate goal. But it is important to have other interests, because there are other things in life that are important. And I often say to people that whenever people are asking me about myself, my job is one of the last things that I will sort of get to, because that's not the first thing I think of whenever I'm thinking about myself. I'm thinking about the position I have in my family, whether it's as a husband or a son or whatever else, or I think about my interests in sort of film or theater or Formula One or whatever else it is, or I think about where I'm from, where I've been, and all of those other things. And hopefully I don't lose sight of the other things that matter, because as terrific as this job is, and as grateful as I am to be in a position where I can do something that I want to do, and where I hopefully am making some small modicum of difference, it is all for sort of a bigger purpose as well, which is to sort of help me enhance those other aspects of my life which are important.
Yeah.
And I appreciate it's much easier to say whenever you're on this side of things, but it does help you keep grounded, I think.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. It's so easy to be sort of overwhelmed by thinking, right, all there is law. So it's just literally law degree, bar course, pupillage applications, and that's it. It takes over. But you do need other things. Sounds like we're quite similar there with our
Yeah.
interest in Formula One. And of course, I do kart racing as well, so that help keep me quite
Oh, very good.
grounded. So I've got to ask you then, are you quite excited for the upcoming 2023 season?
I'm still a bit bitter over the end of the 2021 season.
Oh, okay.
But no, I'm looking forward. I'm hoping. I think it would be nice to see Lewis Hamilton sort of close out with an eighth
Yeah.
world championship. Just it'd be nice from a British point of view, obviously, but it's always nice to see records being broken. So that's who I will be supporting, and who I have been supporting. As
Well,
much as some people may roll their eyes, because I appreciate that. My brother-in-law, for example, lost interest in the Schumacher era whenever you had dominance for so long. But it's nice to see people at the top of their game.
oh, definitely. And you cannot deny the man's skill. Some of the races he was involved in, I think particularly Brazil from last season jumps out where he started the sprint race at the back, and then by halfway through the proper race, he was in first position. So that was just incredible.
Exactly. And then it's just, I suppose, borrowing lessons from somebody who is at the top of their profession, because they put in the hard work and they develop the skills and they have the natural ability, but they also sort of have the uh, respect for others around them, and also the so what's my perception is that he conducts himself with humility and respect and plays the team game as well. So for those of you who have perhaps tuned out in Formula One discussion, just to try and bring it back to how you can learn from the examples of people in other areas and how those lessons can also be employed at the bar.
Yeah, definitely. There we go. Aspiring lawyers, you can look to Lewis Hamilton for it as a
That's
role.
it.
But yeah, no, I completely agree. I'm looking forward to it. I think that the regulation changes that came in last year were fantastic to allow for much closer racing. So should be exciting. For those of you that have tuned out, you can come back. We're back to law again. So we're gonna jump onto a quick fire round now. So just a few quick fun questions towards the end. The first question is one that I ask to all podcast guests, and it's quite an important question, so I need to get your opinion on this. Crisps on a sandwich, do they belong there?
Oh, I haven't had that in a long time, but I I think absolutely. There's no
Yes.
reason why there shouldn't be crisps on a sandwich, particularly the delicacy which is Northern Ireland potato, cheese and onion. You haven't lived until you've had that between two slices of pan white loaf.
I hear good things about those potatoes. I still haven't tried them yet, though.
Oh no, you haven't lived.
Yeah, for me personally, I go for a cheese sandwich with flame grilled steak McCoys on them.
Oh right,
The
okay,
brands are available. So yeah, so I think that's 4-0 for podcast guests now in terms of crisps to no crisps. We're still waiting for somebody to rule against me on that point. So you talked about film and theatre earlier. So what is your favourite film?
Favorite film. So the caveat this slightly is that I think that sort of my favorite film is not necessarily any claim to be the best film of all time, but I am a massive James Bond nerd,
Mm-hmm.
and my favorite James Bond film is Goldfinger on the basis that it set the template of so much to come. And I often sort of debate myself because I think there are other, like From Russia with Love, On Her Majesty's Secret Service, even latterly Casino Royale and Skyfall. I have a soft spot for Roger Moore because he was the first one I saw. I have a soft spot for The World Is Not Enough because it was the first one I saw in the cinema. But because I always say Goldfinger is my favorite Bond film, I must therefore say it is my favorite film, even though you could ask me that question on any other day and I might give a more sophisticated intellectual answer.
Brilliant. Well, yeah, that nice detailed answer there. And you mentioned theatre as well. So favourite show on the theatre?
Again, I fear that I'm going to betray myself as perhaps not as sort of cultured in this area as I think, just simply because I'm probably going to answer the same that a lot of people would, which is Hamilton. We went to see Hamilton 3 times because for a long time we were trying to get tickets and then we got tickets and then without knowing each other, my wife and I each bought the other tickets for our wedding as a wedding gift to go and see it again. So we ended up seeing it 3 times, and I do think that it's the most complete show that I've seen. But we've also seen some really terrific things. So it was a shout out for something we saw recently, which was Jack Absolute Flies Again at the National Theatre. And also, we're a big fan of James Graham, the political playwright. So we've recently seen Best of Enemies, which is about the debate between William F. Buckley Jr. and Gore Vidal, the series of television debates, coming from a conservative and a liberal perspective throughout, I think, the 1968 election in the United States. But we tend to go, there's some playwrights I think we tend to make repeat visits to see, James Graham being one of them, Martin McDonagh another.
Interesting. Oh, well. Okay, favourite food?
Oh, favorite food. I'm not the biggest sort of gourmet fan, but if you were to, hypothetically, if you were ever having to prosecute me, for example, in the United States, John, and I was condemned to death row, and I was given just one meal to see me off my mortal coil, I would have to revert to type and just pick an Ulster fry from back home.
All right.
So it's I always think it's perhaps controversially it's better than a fry up in this country simply because we don't just have toast, we have lots of different types Irish bread, and it's in no way healthy. But I suppose if it was my last meal, I wouldn't be too worried about
Yeah,
that.
you're not going to be too fussed. So how else does it differ? Do you get the same sort of main ingredients in there?
So we
You
have
sausage and
sausage, bacon, let me see, beans, mushrooms, black pudding, soda bread, potato bread. Sometimes you might throw in a pancake, depending where you go. Your eggs, and I think it's best to stick to tradition as well. You sort of go to places now and they try to change it up by putting some sort of fancy relish or something on. It's like, please just stick to the the way it was
yeah,
originally construed. So the little changes I think make a vast difference.
yeah, definitely, yeah. So yeah, slightly different to mine. I would always choose pepperoni pizza.
Okay.
More basic, yeah.
I suppose I should ask you in light of the question about crisps on a sandwich. Do you think pineapple is allowed on a or should be allowed on a pizza?
Yeah, I mean, I've got no problem with that. I think ham and pineapple. I mean, I don't like ham and pineapple, but I don't necessarily see the issue with it. So yeah, I think
Yeah, no. See, as far as I'm concerned, whoever came up with that idea is a genius, and I have friends in Italy who, would be very dismayed to hear me saying that. But I think it's all for pineapple on pizza.
yeah, definitely. All Well, I think that just about brings us to the end. Thank you very much for giving up your time tonight to have a chat to me. I'm sure our listeners have gained a lot from listening to you. So it's been a really interesting conversation. So once again, thank you very much for coming on the podcast.
No, thanks very much, John. It's been good fun.